Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The King and I from 1956. This movie is not one that ever really crosses my mind. It has come up every now and again, but not really one I ever think about. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that despite being incredibly successful and well-liked at the time that it came out by all accounts, it has not aged very well. And I'm going to get into that towards the end of this video, I think. I'm going to try and split it up a little bit. This just came up very recently in the context of some of the music that is in it. And that's really the main reason I ended up watching it, and why it was on any list in the first place, is because there are a couple of very notable songs that are very well known, including probably most notably "Getting to Know You," that are from this movie originally. And I would say that I would guess. The other one being. I don't know what the name of the song actually is. The Whistle a Happy Tune. Those are two very well-known musical numbers from this movie. And I would guess that the vast majority of people who know those songs, and even who could sing them by heart, probably don't know they're from this film. They are so iconic that, in spite of where they come from, they sort of stand on their own as very strong, well-known songs, to the point of being, pop culture songs, basically. This is a weird thing to realize, that so many iconic songs came from, because so many of them do not give away the fact that they are from this film. They are not particularly tied in musically or lyrically to the movie. It's the details of the movie itself. They're not inappropriate in context. They make perfect sense. They totally work. But especially when this is how do I put this? This is a movie that has a bit of an old world viewpoint to it. These very iconic, very Americana sounding songs being from this movie are a little bit weird. That said, this is Rodgers and Hammerstein through and through. I've talked previously about Rodgers and Hammerstein in the context of, I believe it was State Fair, and because that's also a movie that was made by them, I think 10 years before this, if I'm remembering correctly. And again, that was also adapted from play, as this was. What's way more interesting to me about this film actually is some of the behind the scenes stuff about the production of that musical and the actors who are in it. So I'm actually going to talk about the actors last, or toward the end, because I sort of want to come around to that, because that all wraps into sort of why this ages problematically. At its core, I think this is a very strong film. And if you can get past the fact that it is that it ages poorly, visually and musically and performance-wise, it's pretty good all around. Despite, as I've previously expressed, not being the biggest fan of Rodgers and Hammerstein generally, for a variety of reasons. Their compositions are usually okay in my mind, but not great. This does, like I said, have a bunch of really iconic songs on it, and I think they're fantastic and stand the test of time outside the context in which they exist in this movie, or in the musical originally. The visuals, I saw that there were a couple different versions of this available. This is actually surprisingly hard to get to view, but The original transfers from back in the day are incredibly poor. I managed to find one that was seemingly had been restored in some form and looked really excellent, and got to show just how good this movie could have looked or did look when it was originally released. I imagine there was probably, I don't know if there was any upscaling. I would assume for official productions they probably don't do that, but I don't really know. This looked really good. It had been cleaned up really, really well, and that serves some of this movie's greatest strengths, which are its visuals. Now, I'm not going to get into the accuracy of the visuals until later, but as far as the visual spectacle of what's on screen constantly, this movie does a really excellent job. That's a combination of both really good use of light and color and excellent, really intricate costuming and beautiful, like really detailed and decorated sets that also sort of show off the fact that at its core, this is a stage production. There are many performances in this movie, just like as in many other musicals turned into movies, that are basically on a stage for all intents and purposes. They are, there's a clear, whether it's in a room or in an outdoor space or whatever, there's a left and a right side of this space. It's got a back. You don't really rotate too much around it because ultimately it's very much about the presentation of the stage or some version of a stage. And we've talked about that previously with a number of other musical oriented things that we've watched here before. This, like I said, though, goes above and beyond in terms of its visual production, to the point that, like, I honestly can't imagine the amount. There's a ton of detail put into a lot of little things that in the technology for recording and presenting movies at the time this was released probably would have been very much lost in the technology of the time. Or at least I imagine so. I've never watched an original 1956 film on a 1956 cinema projector. I don't really ultimately know what that looks like, but I have to imagine some fidelity was lost that has been subsequently restored. So visually, this is fantastic. It also has some great casting and some great acting. I hesitate a little on that one only because of some things I'm going to talk about later. But this has some very good acting performances from all the key players and quite a few of the minor ones as well. Some very good singing. A little bit underwhelming on the choreography, actually. And that's especially disappointing because Yul Brynner, among other things, was very well known for being quite nimble on his feet and a good dancer. Not so much in the way we think of a lot of other musical performances, the type of tap and traditional American dancing that was seen a lot more in musical performances for the time. But I think he was classically trained in ballet. I'm not 100% on that. I've subsequently forgotten what I read about him before. We'll get back to Yul Brynner. This is not a super complex plot. It's kind of simple. It lines up in a lot of ways to a lot of other musical performance or musicals for the time, especially in some of the tropes that, if I'm honest, don't really fit that well to the plot of this film and ultimately end up muddling the themes a little bit. I guess I should get into talking about the plot just a little bit here, which is basically that this is based on a historical character who wrote her own memoirs, or historical individual who wrote her own memoirs about doing what's going on in the film. That was then adapted into a novel, I believe, or a biography or something like that. That was then adapted into the stage production, which was then adapted into this. It's subsequently been sort of, a lot of the details of the original memoir have been called into question. And in fact, I don't know if it's only this film or it's the greater grouping of media here, have actually been banned in Thailand, formerly Siam, because in no small part because of their inaccuracy, but also some other historical concerns. I'm not going to get into all the details of that. That's a whole thing, but or why it was banned, rather. I'm not going to get into all that. It's just interesting detail to me. The plot of the film ends up a bit muddled, if only because it is following what is generally framed as sort of a romantic plot from a lot of other musicals for this time. Generally speaking, if you have a musical production where you have a male lead and a female lead, and they are they don't start the production together, that at some point throughout there's going to be a romantic through line of some kind or another. Whether or not that is the key plot driver is a different question, but this one's particularly weird because it can't seem to decide exactly where it wants to go. I also don't know if this is accurate to the adaptation, the original adaptation, or the original memoir. I don't think it particularly is. I think it's my vague impression, just based on some skimming, is that this is a lot of liberties taken. No surprise. But especially when this is a plot primarily about a relatively platonic relationship between two people from very different places with very different areas of knowledge and beliefs of how things should go. It's romantic in the literary sense to conceive of those people reconciling their understandings of the world and then wanting to be together, but it doesn't really drive the core plot, which is really more about the characters and about learning, the cross-cultural learning that is sort of possible and present, and in some cases not possible. And so you end up with a lot of that sort of those cross-cultural learnings being muddied by this sort of vague romantic tension that pops up at some inopportune times, and especially at the end, where it comes to sort of a climax that doesn't pay off in any way, because that really wasn't the point in the first place, and the movie seems to know that. But it sort of muddies the story otherwise. There is a whole major theme within the film about that is very pervasive about the dynamics between men and women, not only in the differing cultural views, but also just for the time and place that this was set, which I believe is the 1860s, 1850s, 60s, something like that. And so there's a lot to unpack for the time that this was originally written. There's a lot to unpack for the time at which the musical was written, and then there's a lot to unpack at current year for, like, how do we interpret those sort of gender dynamics and interpret the do a meta interpretation of what that means for it's how you read it in a current era. Again, I'm going to put that off a little bit and get to it a little bit later. Generally, though, I think this is still a very solid, entertaining film. It suffers a little bit in the pacing, it suffers a little bit in the plotting and the tone from time to time, but it's also ultimately still a compelling story presented very pleasingly, both visually and audio, and both in visual and audio. And it's, while it has some problems that don't make me like want to put this on a list of greatest films or greatest musicals or anything like that, it's nonetheless iconic, and I think if you're a connoisseur of musicals, it's at least worth seeing probably once. So now let's get into talking about the casting and some of the stuff behind that as well, because this is where it is really especially interesting to me, outside, not only in this production but outside of it as well. So I've talked a little bit about Yul Brynner before. He's been in, I think, 2 videos, both Westworld and The Magnificent Seven, I believe, were the 2. I don't think there was a third. But Yul Brynner is a very notable actor for quite a few years. He had quite the storied career. And I ended up learning a lot more about him in the pursuit of trying to understand this movie a little better, as I was sort of skimming more to understand the background here. Because one of the first things I stumbled upon is Yul Brynner was not cast only for this movie. He was the originator of the character of the king in the original stage production for Rodgers and Hammerstein. And in fact, what really grabbed me was, if I'm reading this correctly, by the time that he died in the 80s, he had performed The King and I almost 5,000 times on stage. This was not just something that he was known for because it was early in his career and he was very visually striking, and put on a really impressive performance. He was known for it because he had been doing it on stage for decades, to my understanding. Like, that's a crazy run. And again, and maybe I missed something, but that's the impression that I got. So that's kind of wild. So I could get into a whole thing about Yul Brynner and who he was and his sort of effect on movie casting in general. But I think what's one of the perhaps fortunate, perhaps unfortunate side effects or reasons why this movie is probably not as well loved these days as it was back then is Yul Brynner is a white Russian man portraying a Thai king. And this is a whole can of worms. It's many cans of worms, if we're honest. So I'm not going to dig too much into it, not the least of which is because I have some knowledge, but I'm not fully well versed enough to speak on this really thoroughly. There is undeniably a very long history of whitewashing in Hollywood in particular and in media in general. Even in current year, there are lots of equity and accuracy issues as far as casting goes, where even now Hollywood really favors who's going to drive box office numbers over who is perhaps the most accurate or the best casting. Let's just leave it at that. And while Yul Brynner has not only here but in quite a few other castings that he had over his career, is cast outside of his birth, the it's a little tricky to unpack. Part of that is because he liked to tell tall tales about himself quite a lot, to the point that a repeated, apparently not truth that he told allegedly was that he was descendant of he had Mongolian heritage. That is not outside the realm of possibility. I mean, Russia was big, Mongolia is big. They have a very long common border. Who knows? And he certainly has a complexion that is not reminiscent of, it does not reflect necessarily him being a white Russian person. So I think especially for an audience of the time, both for this movie and for movies in general, and one that was less able to get sort of, let's say, accurate information about who people were, the story of who this person is, what they look like, etc., is much more the realm of, yeah, it makes enough sense, versus, oh, well, actually, we can show that it isn't. So that's not to try to excuse any aspect of this, only to say that a lot of Yul Brynner's castings over his career would end up being sort of in the realm of questionable to a modern eye, but for the time were probably not, especially by comparison to someone like John Wayne, who in one of the most offensive cases also portrayed a Mongolian person. I don't, was it Genghis Khan? I don't remember. It's like hardcore brown face, and he's not putting on, and he's a terrible actor. I've talked about him before. I hate him. I don't like seeing him ever. I don't like hearing his voice. He's awful. And having him like brown faced up in that movie and several others that he did, it like really puts into perspective how inoffensive by comparison Yul Brynner really is. That's not excusing anything, but it's a little weird. There's a lot of other castings around in this movie that I'm actually kind of curious about, and there's very little detail that I could find out about it. There are definitely quite a few other people in this movie that are white, but who have been, I don't know what they did with Yul Brynner's makeup. He looks like his usual self. He is very generally dark-skinned by comparison to most of the people he's alongside in most of his movies. So I don't really know what they did for his makeup. There are some other people in this film who are very clearly darkened, and it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good makeup-wise, and it doesn't look good socially and culturally either. But again, that's a matter of modern perspectives. What is actually more interesting to me is that there are quite a few extras and small parts in this film, especially the children, who I think they actually, by all accounts, seem to have not cast white kids. They, at least not all of them. And I don't know who those kids were. There's very little documentation. But they didn't just brown face this whole film. So that's something. It's not a lot, but it's something, especially for 1956. That said, there's no way to a modern viewer to watch this without having quite a few concerns, not only about casting, but about the structure of the film as well. This film is undeniably very imperialistic in its view. And it also has quite a few tropes of sort of white saviorism and sort of the idea of non-white people being quote unquote barbaric and these other things. What's interesting to me, though, is thinking from a historical perspective of both when it was written and when it was performed. Again, by comparison, this is a relatively inoffensive inoffensive and almost in some ways progressive film in a lot of ways. Narratively, the narrative itself directly critiques the viewpoint of people outside of Siam or Thailand, basically looking down upon them and assuming that they are uncultured savages, and that they have a culture of their own that is flourishing, and that the king's efforts to modernize and incorporate sort of some European ideals and European culture and technology is not particularly an effort for him to like become European. It's more to just take what is useful from another culture. That said, ultimately, the grander narrative, the more pervasive subtext is much more one about this sort of childish character who has a great amount of power and lives in a way that is culturally unacceptable to European eyes, being educated in the ways of more civilized people. Again, this is in the phrasing of the movie, not mine, but that's ultimately how it comes off. That said, it's still more subtle in its presentation than a lot of things that would come before, at this time, and even after it. And so while it doesn't age well, it ages a lot better than a lot of other things, including other Rodgers and Hammerstein productions that have not aged well either. This is again, I hesitate to say it's progressive. It's very problematic, but it's at least taking a slightly more egalitarian look at a culture that it's still looking down upon. That said, it's hard to unpack where exactly you draw those lines. Do you draw the line at 1956 that you say, well, this needed to be, in order to be acceptable, this needed to be culturally appropriate for the time that it was written? Or do you go back 100 years earlier to when it was written and say, well, as long as the narrative is contextualized in that time and place, it's okay, problematic, but like still interpretable. And this is both a question of like a greater cultural acceptance for us and the acceptability of continuing to engage with this piece of literature, but also individual comfort. There are going to be some people who watch this and aren't bothered by it at all, and some people who are probably going to be more offended than I. So it's just, it's a constant interesting thing, especially as I go through watching a lot of older movies in this series. This is obviously going to be one that is probably more than almost anything on my list going to be questionable. But the same kind of questions come up, to lesser extents in quite a few things that are going on, 40, 50, 60, 100 years old now, because that's where we are in cinema and media production in general, is I'm still able to watch things from 100 years ago. And so the constant sort of struggle between making a current media critique while still understanding the context in which a piece of art is made, that in and of itself, in a meta sense, is a very interesting process for me, and not one I think that there's a firm answer for anyone for. It's just up to your personal ability to interpret and your willingness to engage with it. So again, this sort of comes back around to me saying that I think this is still a very impressive production, and as long as you are able to stomach the sort of concerns that might come from a modern viewing, that one, as long as you can get through that, I think there's a lot to be appreciated here. I still don't think you should, gloss over the issues with it. But it's worth acknowledging, but still understanding. Anyway, I think that's about all I have to say on this one. There's a few little things, but yeah, this one's pretty all right. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.